What we've learned so far is that there's a principle of transactions which we call kinyan. So if I'm the person making the transaction, I'm acquiring, I'm called the koine, and the act that I'm doing is also in the present tense, koine. Whereas if I'm the person who is selling, gifting, sharing, pledging, then I'm called the makne, the one who is causing the transaction to happen. And we said that a person cannot be makne something that doesn't yet exist. So we can't make a viable transaction over an item that hasn't yet been built, hasn't yet been born, hasn't yet grown on the tree, etc. We also said that these rules are going to associate with how we live our lives in spiritual terms, because we are supposed to take the things of our lives, we're supposed to take the items that exist, the experiences that we have in the mundane reality, and we're supposed to then transform them all into something which is holy. So what we're supposed to do is be makne, all the facets of our lives, to Hashem. That's what we're supposed to do. So if that's our role in this world, we can almost, you could say we're almost agents for Hashem to go and care for his assets or to build his wealth. So there's all this resource out there called life, and our job is to take this resource called life and to transform it into something which is of meaning and something which has a holy association, etc. So if I take, for example, as we learned yesterday, a piece of food, and I make sure that the food is kosher, and I say a bracha before I eat the food, and ideally I'm intentional to eat the food with the understanding that I'm going to use this nutrition so that I'm able to do more of what Hashem wants, then I've been makne that food. I've now acquired that food on Hashem's behalf, or I've transacted that food across from the world of the mundane into the world of the holy. But the big question we had is, can you be makne something that doesn't yet exist? Which essentially, as we see, is going to relate to the idea of how much power or how much reliability do we have to undertake things for the future. And that's why this is really going to boil down to a question about making resolutions. Because I want to make the transaction, I want to transform something to make it holy, but how do I know that my intentions are actually going to pan out? Because we all know this, the story, right? We make ourselves promises, we make the community promises, we go up at the bima and we make a promise, whatever the case is, and then life happens, and it doesn't always play out. So what we learned halachically is that there are three different categories. Today we're going to look at two of those categories. The first is that if I have a tree, in fact, the original example that the Gemara uses is a date palm. So if I've got a date palm, and I say that I'm selling you the dates that have not yet grown on the tree, so we say that is not a binding transaction. And so when those dates do appear on the tree, either one of us could back off from this agreement because we made an agreement about something that doesn't yet exist. That was the one scenario. The other scenario that we had was that I make a deal with you where I say, I'm actually selling you the tree, but only to the extent that you have the rights to the fruit, which means after the season, the tree will still be mine. But for the period from now until the dates appear, the tree is yours to the extent that you get the rights to the fruit. In that case, you would actually be allowed to have the fruit, and it is a binding transaction, even if we made the transaction before the fruit began to appear on the tree.
Rabbi, do you know that that's a common practice with farmers?
That what?
You sell the produce of the land even before you've planted it.
Okay, so it's halachically, it's
Today.
not a... So I'm saying halachically would not be a binding... Would not be a binding transaction.
My family, I know.
Okay.
For a fact. Sorry.
So now what we're gonna do now is we're going to identify the phrases that we use to represent these two types of transaction. The one is selling peiros of fruit, but as you'll see in a moment, peiros also has another meaning. So that's where the person says, we're making a deal now with regards to the fruit that has not yet begun to grow. The other is called Ilon Lepeiroisov. I'm selling the Ilon, the tree, Lepeiroisov, for the fruit that it's going to yield. Okay, so those are the two terms that we're going to explore. And what those two terms relate to is as follows. The concept of peiros, of fruits, doesn't only refer to fruit. It's actually a fairly broad term that we could use to refer to many things. For example, this morning, you would have said in the morning brachas, Elu devarim, these are the things, she'adam oichel peirosehem ba'olam hazeh, that you eat the fruit of these things in this world, v'hakeren kayemes la'olam haba, but the principle is reserved for the world to come, which basically means that there are mitzvahs, that we learn in that particular Mishnah, that there are mitzvahs where the primary reward for those mitzvahs we'll only experience in the next world. But what we'll get in this world is the peiros, which essentially means the product. That there's almost a secondary product. There's the primary reward, and then there's a secondary product that you could enjoy still in this world. So one of the examples, kibud av va'em, right? So honoring parents, what does it say? When a person honors their parents, they get long life. Long life is in this world. That's part of the peiros. That's part of the extras. It's the bonus that you get in this world. But the primary reward for any mitzvah is going to be in the next world. So that tells you that the word peiros really means the things that are the product of something else. In exactly the same way as the fruit is the product of a tree, the things are the product of something else. Which means in human terms, we could say that there is the person who would be comparable to the tree. And that's not a surprise to us because the Torah says that man is the tree of a field. So there is this comparison between the human being like the tree, and then there are the peiros, which means the things that the human being produces. So if we're talking about this movement, which we're supposed to engage in, of taking things from the mundane world and transacting so that they cross over and become holy, meaningful things, then essentially what we could say is there is the protagonist, which is us, we're the tree, and the fruits that we produce every time that we align something with what Hashem wants. Or in much simpler terms, there's the person, and then there are the things that the person does. The positive things that we do, which includes mitzvahs, those are our fruits. Okay? So now that we understand this concept that we are comparable to the tree, and the mitzvahs that we perform are compared to the fruits, let's plug that into the halachic principle. The halachic principle says, if I want to talk about what's going to happen in the future, so I cannot talk about what's going to happen to the fruit of a tree. I can't talk about that. Because ein adam makne davar sheloi bo la'olam. We cannot transact about something that doesn't yet exist. So for example, not a matter of whether I can take a resolution or not, we'll still get to that. But I can't right now claim credit for a mitzvah that I intend to do. Because who says I'll do it? Anything could happen. So we can't transact over fruits that haven't yet grown. I can't have value from a mitzvah that hasn't yet been done. Whereas, if I could say that the whole tree has already been engaged in this transaction, like the person who says, Ilan lepe roisav, I'm selling you the tree vis-a-vis the fruit, that's a more reliable predictor of the future. The tree now belongs to this guy to the extent that he gets the fruit. So that means the transaction has now essentially taken place. What does that mean in spiritual terms? So if we had to do an analysis, a little bit of introspection, we could ask ourselves these questions. Question number one, do I have fruit, meaning do I have mitzvahs that I do for Hashem? Yes or no? We'll all say yes. Maybe I don't have as many as I want, maybe not as often as I want, but every one of us can confidently say we produce fruit, even if it's seasonal fruit. So some people, it's the season, Yom Kippur, they're in shul. Pesach, they have a Seder. Could be seasonal fruit, but every person has fruit they produce. However, if we're also honest, at the same time that we have fruit, we can also acknowledge that the tree, meaning the whole makeup of who I am, is not necessarily always aligned with that fruit. In simple English, I might very well do a lot of what Hashem wants, but I'm not necessarily always thinking and feeling aligned with what Hashem wants. And that's our reality. Our reality is we have distractions, we have temptations, we have moments of weakness, moments of laziness. So, yes, of course, we want to do what Hashem wants, and we do what Hashem wants, but we don't always do what Hashem wants. And sometimes even when we're doing it because that's what we've committed to, or that's what we've habituated to, but we're not necessarily fully present. So, sometimes there's a whole analysis that you could do on this. Have you ever driven and landed up in a different destination to where you were supposed to go?
Definitely.
Does that ever happen? And I'm not talking about because we got lost. I'm talking about because we all have those places that we typically go to if we're not paying attention. So that's why you could do an interesting analysis of a person's life. Where do you land up when you're not paying attention? Where do you land up? Because that tells us what your life is really all about. So if, for example, you're at that phase of life where you're taking kids to school every day, then there's a pretty good chance that if you're not paying attention, you'll end up at school, even though you were going somewhere else. Or if your office is a distance away from your home, and that's the route that you drive every single day, it's possible you'll head out in that general direction going somewhere else. You'll find yourself at your office. Tells us about your life. So it's possible for a person to produce fruit, which means I'm actually doing what I should, but it's on autopilot, and I'm actually going somewhere else. In my head, in my experience, in my intention, in my priorities, I could be going somewhere else. So when it's only the fruit that are involved in the transaction is a lot less reliable, and therefore I can't really bank on how the transaction is going to play out. So what does that mean in really practical terms? Let's say that I come to the minyan every day. Okay, because it's a safe space. Talking about people who come to the minyan every single day. So I come to the minyan every single day. Is that a guarantee that I will come to the minyan every single day going forward? Just because that's how things have been until now. Is that a predictor of going forward? I don't know. Because these are peiros. This is activity that I'm engaged in. It's healthy activity. It's positive activity. However, the real me also sometimes feels, it's a little bit dark and cold outside. And maybe today, just today, maybe I could skip. And the minute we do the just today, before you know it, you can unravel the whole process. Because the things that I do, even if they're habit forming, don't necessarily illustrate where I am deeply. On the other hand, if you had somebody who is in a stage or state where the Elon Lepeiroisov, it's not just that I'm doing the things that I'm supposed to do, but the whole tree has been engaged in this transaction, which means I am invested in this transaction in a very deep and meaningful way, then you're pretty much guaranteed that the fruit will always fall, that they'll grow, they'll ripen, they'll be healthy, and you can transact on that fruit. Which means, and every one of us has a taste of this, because every one of us has certain principles and values which have become totally embedded in who we are, that it's no longer just what I do, this is who I am. So let's say, just a radical example, let's say that there's a person who is not fundamentally an honest person, but over time they've learned that if you're not honest in business, you might get into a lot of trouble. So they run their business in an honest fashion because they want to avoid the tax man, or they want to avoid prison time, or whatever the case is. But they're not fundamentally honest. Well, then we don't know what's going to happen next. Maybe there's a really lucrative opportunity that comes up that's just a little bit shady, and maybe they'll take it. But if I have a value of honesty, that's what I care about. I care about integrity, and I care about being honest, and I care about law and order. And then it's not going to happen. I'm not going to slip into this opportunity, because it's exactly talk about a South African example, right? So it's the guy gets pulled over by the traffic cop. He gets three kinds of people. The first kind of person gets pulled over. He doesn't even ask any questions. Here you go. Have some lunch. Leave me alone. Gesundheit. Okay? And they'll say, this is Africa. It's not even immoral. This is just the way we roll in this country. Then you get the person who fundamentally believes that bribery is wrong. But the cop makes his life difficult. He says, listen, you're going to have to come with me to the station. It's going to be a whole business. Or we could settle on a spot fine. So the guy says, you know what? You didn't say bribe. You said spot fine. In that case, I'm willing to, this time I'll just compromise a little bit of my values of integrity and honesty. And then you get the kind of person that finds bribery to be completely objectionable, and they're going to say, this is a matter of principle, and I'm digging my heels in, and there's no way that I'm playing the system. Give me the fine, and I'll have my day in court, and whatever the case is, because I cannot, this is who I am. It's not just something that I do. It's not just a stated value. This is who I am. I really care about integrity, and I really feel that bribery is completely inappropriate. And that's why, under no circumstances, am I going to do anything which is not correct. May even be that you'll argue that this is Africa and this is the law, whatever. It doesn't make a difference to me. So we could each have a taste in our lives of a certain area where the tree itself is already part of the transaction with Hashem. Not only the fruit, not only the activities. The tree, the whole core of who I am, is actually part of the transaction with Hashem. So those are your two possibilities. That I've given Hashem the things that Torah requires, versus I've given Hashem a piece of myself. Those are the two options. Now we can drill it down further. That's what distinguishes every single person, all the way up to what the Alter Rebbe in Tanya describes as the ultimate version of a Beinoni. So even though we translate a Beinoni as an average person, when the Alter Rebbe discusses a Beinoni, he explains that a Beinoni is way beyond average. A Beinoni is a very, very spiritually advanced person. A Beinoni is somebody who always behaves aligned with what the Torah wants, but still experiences the internal struggles of temptation and distraction and etc. A tzaddik, on the other hand, the fundamental difference between a tzaddik and a Beinoni is not in behavior. If I had to observe the two personalities as an outsider, they both look equally amazing. Because both the tzaddik and the Beinoni would be people who not only always do what Hashem wants and never transgress, but they always speak in a way that the Torah would approve of, and they never slip up. And not only that, they never entertain an inappropriate thought. Now, a Beinoni will still have inappropriate thoughts that pop inadvertently into their minds, but they're really good at self-control, and so they won't allow the inappropriate thought to actually develop, to actually take hold. A tzaddik, on the other hand, doesn't have that. A tzaddik never experiences an inappropriate thought. That's what a tzaddik means. Tzaddik is not just a scorecard, that you're getting 10 out of 10 in terms of your behavior. Tzaddik is somebody who has fundamentally changed themselves, which means that only a tzaddik can say that they're at that level of ilan lepeirosav, that the whole tree belongs to Hashem. The whole tree belongs to Hashem. In fact, it's not even ilan lepeirosav. It's not only that the tree belongs to Hashem insofar as the fruit is concerned, they've transacted that the whole tree belongs to Hashem. That means everything about me, just as a tree has roots and a trunk and branches and leaves and fruit, which effectively represents in the human being every part of who I am, the core of my being, the processes that I use, my intellect, my emotions, the thoughts I have, the words I say, the actions I do, all of that is acquired by Hashem. That's a tzaddik. Every part of them is acquired by Hashem. But if a person is not yet at that level of tzaddik, it is still possible for a person to say, you know what, okay, so the tree, I'm not selling my tree. I'm not relinquishing my identity. I'm not yet at that level where I could say I'm just purely a vehicle for godliness. But what I can say is, ilan lepeirosav. And this is really the world in which the Beinoni lives, which is basically the tree belongs to Hashem insofar as what it produces. Meaning to say, I'll still have my internal struggles, but none of those are going to affect what I produce when it actually comes to behavior and words, which is a more subtle version of behavior, and even developed thought processes, as opposed to just spontaneous, impulsive thoughts that come through my mind. All of that I'm pledging to Hashem. So I'm pledging to Hashem my ilan, my person, to the extent that whatever I'm going to produce is going to be aligned with Hashem. So what does this halacha teach us? It teaches us, it goes without saying, that if you had to sell your tree to somebody else, needless to say, all of the fruit would then belong to that person. Even the fruits that are going to still grow in decades' time, they belong to that person because you gave them the tree. So that would be a tzaddik. A tzaddik is somebody who is at such a level of dedication to Hashem that they've completely uprooted themselves, essentially, from the world in which they live, and or the world in which humans live, and they've supplanted themselves in the world in which Hashem lives. So everything about their lives is automatically and completely aligned with what Hashem wants. That is an extremely rare kind of person. So the halacha is not even going to get into that discussion because A, it's very obvious what the halachic ruling is, and B, it's a very straightforward but very uncommon case where a person says, you know what, I'm going to sell you my tree. It doesn't happen that often. Whereas I'm going to contract with you to say, we'll make a deal that the tree is yours to the extent that you can enjoy the fruits, is a more common version of the spiritual experience. That's what a person says, I'm pledging myself to Hashem, at least in terms of my behavior. That should be our aspiration. Every single one of us should wish to get to the point that I'm not just saying, Hashem, I'm giving you produce, which means every single time an opportunity arises, I'm going to do my best to align that opportunity with what Hashem wants. So every single time I'm going to have to reinvent how I do it, because that's how we deal with our spirituality every single day, right? Every time that we have a mitzvah opportunity, we have to warm ourselves up again and power up and say, okay, now I'm going to do the mitzvah. The aspiration should be that I want to get to a point that the Ilan Leperoisov, that I have dedicated myself to Hashem to the extent that I belong to Hashem in regards to how I behave. I know that my internal stuff is going to take way more work to actually align, but at least I could align my behaviors. So I'm kind of making the pledge that I'll be so dedicated to Hashem that my behaviors will align with what Hashem wants. If I get there, I become what is called a Beinoni. That's in a really, really developed state of spirituality. The question is, A, what if I don't get there? Which seems to be a pretty common scenario. B, even if I do get there, what do I do until I get there? In other words, in simple English, the big question we have to ask ourselves is, so if I'm not that spiritually developed and I'm not that aligned with what Hashem wants, then how could I ever be sure that any commitment, any resolution that I make will actually come to fruition if I'm not that level of dedication, which is pretty much our problem. We're constantly making ourselves promises or making Hashem promises about our spiritual development. How do we know that they're ever going to work if the tree, which means the core of my being, is sitting firmly rooted still in my backyard and isn't in any way moving closer to Hashem's territory? So how could I ever trust myself to make a resolution?